The last time Colleen Mercer stood on solid ground without a mission waiting for her, she was 24 years old, still young enough to believe the world owed her something, and still foolish enough to think she could collect. That was 21 years ago. Now she was 45, and the world had taken more from her than she ever imagined possible. The morning she left the Navy was cold and gray, the kind of morning that made the port city of Norfolk, Virginia, feel like it existed at the very edge of the earth, where the land gave up trying and let the ocean win. A sharp Atlantic wind came off the harbor, carrying the smell of salt cold metal and diesel fuel from the long row of warships anchored along the waterfront. Low clouds pressed down over the city, like a lid turning the winter light into something pale and flat, the kind of light that made everything look older than it was. Norfolk had always been a military town. Generations of sailors had walked. These same sidewalks carried their bags through these same gates, kissed their families goodbye in these same parking lots. The city understood departure better than almost any place in America, but it had never learned how to handle the ones who came back different from the way they left. Colleen walked slowly along the concrete path leading away from the base. She wore a dark green jacket over a plain gray shirt boots that had crossed 4 continents, and a face that carried the kind of stillness most people found difficult to read. She was tall for a woman about 5'9", with a lean athletic frame that had once been stronger. Her dark auburn hair was pulled back in a short practical cut that hadn't changed much in 20 years. A few strands of silver had recently appeared near her temples, though she hadn't noticed them yet. Her face was angular and serious. High cheekbones, a straight nose, a jaw that suggested stubbornness even when her mouth was relaxed. A thin scar crossed the outer edge of her left eyebrow, a souvenir from a mission in a country most Americans couldn't find on a map. Her eyes were gray-green, steady and watchful, the kind of eyes that had spent too many years scanning rooftops, tree lines, and darkened corridors. They were the eyes of someone who had learned long ago that danger rarely announced itself. For more than 2 decades, Colleen had served in the United States Navy, most of it attached to special operations units that worked in the shadows. Long deployments to places that never appeared in newspapers. Missions planned in whispers and executed in silence. She had been one of the few women to operate consistently alongside Tier 1 units, not because the system welcomed her, but because she was simply too good to leave behind. But recently her body had begun to betray her. Old injuries in her lower back and right shoulder had worsened steadily over the past 2 years. A persistent tremor sometimes flickered through her left hand after periods of extended strain. A tremor she had hidden from her commanding officers for as long as she could. Navy doctors had finally examined her, thoroughly running tests over several months before delivering the verdict she never wanted to hear. It was time for her to step down. Not because she wanted to, because the machine that was her body could no longer perform the way the mission demanded. For Colleen, leaving the Navy felt less like retirement and more like being quietly erased from the only identity she had ever truly understood. Walking beside her was Bear. The German Shepherd moved with a controlled, fluid confidence despite the slight unevenness in his gait. He was large, nearly 90 pounds of muscle, and thick sable-black fur that rippled slightly in the wind. His ears stood tall and alert, twin receivers constantly turning toward distant sounds most people would never notice. A thin, pale scar ran along the left side of his muzzle, barely visible beneath the fur, a reminder of an operation that had nearly killed them both. His right shoulder still carried a newer wound, a deep muscle tear sustained during their final mission together 3 months earlier. The military veterinarians had cleared him for release, but warned that full recovery would take time. A faded compression wrap still circled the joint beneath his fur, and on cold mornings like this one, he favored the leg, slightly shifting his weight with the practiced subtlety of a creature too proud to limp openly. Bear was 6 years old, fully mature, still powerful and fiercely loyal. He had served alongside Colleen during some of the most dangerous missions of her career. Military working dogs were often rotated between handlers, but Bear and Colleen had formed a bond that the brass eventually stopped trying to break. The dog had learned to recognize her breathing patterns, the subtle tension in her shoulders, before a dangerous moment, even the slight change in her voice when she was lying about being afraid. More than once, Bear had saved lives. He detected explosives buried beneath a dirt road outside Kandahar. He pulled Colleen flat to the ground half a second before gunfire erupted from behind a compound wall during a night raid that went wrong in ways the official report would never fully describe. The Navy listed Bear as a military working dog, a piece of equipment with a pulse and a service record. To Colleen, he was the only family she had left. Now the two of them walked away from the base gates together, neither of them wearing a uniform anymore. A black pickup truck waited in the far corner of the parking lot, its paint faded by years of sun and neglect. Colleen placed her worn duffel bag into the truck bed and stood still for a moment, her hand resting on the cold metal edge. She looked back toward the base one last time. 21 years. She had entered those gates as a young woman with something to prove. She was leaving as a middle-aged woman with a tremor in her hand and a dog who trusted her more than any human ever had. She opened the passenger door. Bear jumped inside, landing a fraction heavier on his left side to spare the healing shoulder. "All right, partner," she said quietly. Her voice was calm, low, steady. But the words carried a weight that neither of them fully understood yet. "Let's go home." The drive across Norfolk took less than 30 minutes. The route carried them through neighborhoods built decades earlier for military families rotating in and out of the base. Modest houses lined the quiet streets, their small yards bordered by chain-link fences and bare winter trees. Most residents were still at work. The sidewalks were empty. The cold wind rattled the skeletal branches overhead and pushed dead leaves along the gutters in small, restless circles. Colleen's house stood near the end of a narrow street lined with young maple trees that had never quite grown the way someone had hoped. It was a modest two-story place with pale blue siding and a small wooden porch facing the road. The house was not large, but it had once felt warm. She had bought it nearly 8 years earlier, not long after marrying her husband Philip. Philip Mercer was 38, 7 years younger than Colleen. He had been a pediatric nurse at a hospital near the base, a man with gentle hands, a patient voice, and the kind of quiet kindness that made children trust him instantly. When they married, Colleen believed she had found the one person who could handle the long absences, the unanswered phone calls, the constant uncertainty that came with loving someone whose job description was classified. For a while, Philip handled it. Then he stopped being able to. When Colleen pulled the truck into the driveway, something felt wrong immediately. The porch light was off. The curtains hung open. The front yard had a strange, untouched stillness, like a room in a house where no one lives anymore. She stepped out of the truck slowly. Bear jumped down beside her, favoring his right shoulder briefly, before steadying himself. His nose worked the cold air. His ears tilted forward. The front door was locked. Colleen pulled out her key and opened it. The silence hit her before anything else. The living room was empty. The couch was gone. The bookshelf they had assembled together during their first year of marriage had vanished. The framed photographs that once covered the walls had been removed, leaving only faint rectangular shadows on the faded paint where the frames had hung. The walls looked like a face, after someone had taken away all its expressions. Colleen walked further into the house. Her boots echoed softly against the bare wooden floor. The kitchen cabinets were half empty. The bedroom closet stood open, most of the clothes gone. Only a few wire hangers remained swaying slightly from the draft that crept through the old windows. Bear padded quietly behind her, his nails clicking against the floorboards. The dog moved from room to room, sniffing carefully, pausing at doorways, searching for something familiar that was no longer there. Colleen stood in the center of the living room for a long moment, her eyes tracing the empty walls. Then she pulled out her phone. She scrolled to a name she hadn't called in weeks. Philip Mercer. The phone rang 3 times before someone answered. "Colleen." His voice sounded tired. Not angry, not cold. Just tired the way a person sounds after they have already grieved something and come out the other side with nothing left to feel. "Where are you?" Colleen asked. A long pause filled the line. Then Philip spoke again. "I didn't know exactly when you'd be back." Colleen looked around the empty room. "I'm back now." Another silence followed, the kind of silence that has its own gravity. When Philip finally spoke, his words came slowly, carefully, like someone walking across thin ice. "I'm sorry, Colleen." His voice broke slightly. "I waited as long as I could. I really did." Colleen leaned one hand against the wall beside her. She said nothing. "You were always gone," Philip continued. "Weeks, months, sometimes longer. And when you were gone, I never knew if you were safe. I never knew if the next phone call would be someone telling me you weren't coming home." His breathing grew unsteady. "I couldn't live like that anymore." Colleen closed her eyes for a moment. The room felt even colder than before. "Are you safe?" she asked. "Yes." A pause. Then quieter. "I met someone." The words hung between them like a bridge neither could cross. Outside, a gust of wind shook the branches along the street. Colleen opened her eyes. She looked at the empty walls, the missing furniture, the outline of a life that had already been carefully dismantled while she was on the other side of the world. "I understand," she said. And she meant it, because deep down, Colleen had always known the truth. While she had been protecting her country, Philip had been fighting a different kind of war, the war against loneliness, fear, and the slow erosion of hope. A war that no training manual prepares you for. "You deserve a life without that fear," Colleen added calmly. Philip began to cry softly on the other end of the line. "I never wanted to hurt you." "You didn't." Colleen took a slow breath. "The house is still in your name, too. Keep it." Philip didn't respond for several seconds. Then he whispered her name one more time, Colleen, as if saying it could somehow undo the distance that had built between them over the years. But she had already made her decision. After the call ended, Colleen stood motionless in the empty living room. The silence pressed against her from every direction. Bear walked over slowly and sat beside her, pressing his shoulder gently against her leg. His amber-brown eyes looked up at her face with the patient, steady gaze of a creature who understood loss, even if he could not name it. Colleen reached down and scratched behind his ear. "Well, partner," she murmured. "Looks like it's just us now." The house felt colder than it should have. Colleen walked upstairs one last time. In the back corner of the bedroom closet, behind a stack of old uniforms Philip had not bothered to take, sat a small wooden box she had not opened in years. She knelt down and lifted the lid. Inside were only a few things. An old photograph of her parents standing on the porch of a house she had not seen in over 20 years. A worn pocket knife her father had given her on her 15th birthday, the handle made of dark walnut, the blade still sharp. And a folded road map of Wyoming, creased and softened from years of being carried and never used, with a small town circled in faded ink. Elk Hollow. Colleen placed each item carefully into her duffel bag. She zipped the bag shut. Then she walked down the stairs, out the front door, and across the driveway to the truck without looking back. Bear followed her down the porch steps. The cold Norfolk wind swept across the empty street, moving through the bare trees like a whisper looking for someone to listen. Neither of them knew it yet, but the road they were about to take would carry them back to a place that had been waiting for them for over 2 decades. The highway stretched westward beneath a pale winter sky that seemed to go on forever. For 3 days, Colleen Mercer drove across the country with her duffel bag on the passenger seat and Bear resting behind her in the back of the truck cab. The journey carried them through long, empty highways, across frozen plains, where the wind never stopped, and through quiet towns where gas stations glowed like small islands of warmth in the early darkness. She stopped only when she had to. Fuel. Water for Bear. A few hours of restless sleep in the truck at rest areas where the semis rumbled through the night like mechanical ghosts. She didn't turn on the radio. She didn't call anyone. The silence was its own kind of company. By the time they reached Wyoming, the landscape had changed completely. The flat highways of the east gave way to wide valleys rolling beneath distant mountain ranges, their peaks dressed in fresh snow that caught the last light of afternoon and held it like a secret. Dense pine forests climbed the hillsides in dark green waves. The air was different here. Dry, sharp, thin enough that each breath felt like it mattered more. Colleen rolled down the truck window slightly. The cold rushed in immediately, carrying the scent of pine resin and snow. And something underneath both of those things, something older, like the smell of a place remembering who used to live there. For the first time in weeks, she breathed deeply. Bear lifted his head from the back seat. His ears pricked forward. The German Shepherd's nose worked the incoming air with sudden intensity, his nostrils flaring as he sorted through layers of scent that no human could detect. Something in the air had changed for him, too. They were getting close. The small town of Elk Hollow, Wyoming, appeared gradually along the highway like a memory surfacing through deep water. A quiet settlement of fewer than 2,000 people, tucked between low forested hills and a frozen creek that wound through the valley floor. A faded wooden sign stood at the town entrance, its paint chipped and peeling from decades of brutal winters. Elk Hollow, Wyoming, population 1,847. Colleen hadn't seen this town in more than 20 years. She had left at 24, restless and determined, carrying a recruiter's promise and a one-way bus ticket to boot camp. Back then, Elk Hollow had felt too small, too quiet, too far from everything that mattered. She had been certain that the real world existed somewhere else, in the vast machinery of the military, in the chaos and purpose of distant wars. She had spent 2 decades proving herself right. Now driving slowly down the main street, she was no longer sure what she had proved. The town looked almost exactly the same. A single paved road ran through the center, lined on both sides by old brick buildings and wooden storefronts. The diner was still there, its neon sign buzzing faintly behind the window. The small grocery store where she had worked summer shifts at 16 still stood on the corner, though the awning had been replaced and the name had changed. Snow rested along the sidewalks in uneven ridges where the plows had pushed it during the last storm. A few pickup trucks were parked along the street. 2 men in heavy coats stood talking outside the hardware store, their breath rising in small white clouds. A dog barked somewhere in the distance. Time moved differently in places like this. It didn't rush. It accumulated layer by layer like snow on a fence post. Bear suddenly stood up in the back seat. He placed his front paws against the truck window and pressed his nose to the glass, his ears rotating forward with sharp attention. A low sound came from his throat. Not quite a bark. Something closer to recognition. They were passing a narrow road that led uphill away from the main street toward the edge of town, where the houses sat farther apart and the forest pressed closer. Colleen's hands tightened slightly on the steering wheel. She knew that road. She had walked it 1,000 times as a child, kicking stones along the gravel shoulder, racing her own shadow on summer evenings when the light lasted until 9. She hesitated. Bear gave a short, definite bark. His tail began to move. Not the casual wag of a happy pet. The deliberate, focused wag of a working dog who had found what he was looking for. Colleen turned the wheel. The truck climbed the gentle slope. The houses grew more spread out, each sitting on wider plots of land surrounded by old wooden fences and stands of tall ponderosa pine. The road narrowed. Gravel replaced pavement. The trees closed in overhead. Then the road ended, and there it was. Her childhood home. The house stood alone on a small rise overlooking a frozen field that stretched toward the tree line. It was a simple structure, 2 stories with a covered porch that ran along the front and a stone chimney rising from the eastern wall. Once it had been painted white. Now the paint had faded to a tired gray, and in places the bare wood showed through like old bones beneath thin skin. Several boards along the porch railing were cracked or missing entirely. Tall dead weeds pushed through the snow around the foundation. The windows were dark. The yard was empty. The house looked the way a person looks when they have been waiting for someone who never comes. Colleen parked the truck along the gravel shoulder. She did not get out immediately. She sat behind the wheel and looked at the house for a long time. Memories came without permission. Running across that field with her father on summer evenings, the grass up to her waist. His laughter carrying across the open air like something you could almost hold. Helping her mother plant wildflowers along the porch railing in May. The soil dark and cool under their fingers. The smell of fresh coffee drifting through the kitchen every morning before school, mixing with the scent of pine that seemed to live permanently in the walls. Her father, Garrett Mercer, had been a carpenter. A tall, broad-shouldered man with calloused hands and a quiet voice that somehow carried more authority than shouting ever could. He built furniture, repaired barns, and once spent an entire summer helping rebuild a wooden bridge over the town's creek after a flood washed the old one away. Her mother, June Mercer, had been the kind of woman who remembered everyone's birthday, who left books on neighbors' porches, who visited the town library every Tuesday afternoon as faithfully as some people attended church. They were both gone now. Garrett had died of a heart attack 11 years ago. June followed 3 years later, as if she had simply decided that a world without him was not a world she cared to stay in. Colleen had not been present for either funeral. She had been deployed both times, somewhere on the other side of the planet doing classified things for a country that would never know her name. She received the news through official channels, cold words on a screen, and grieved alone in the dark corners of military installations where no one asked questions about red eyes or silence. She opened the truck door. Bear jumped out immediately, landing in the snow with a soft crunch. He favored his right shoulder for half a step, then steadied himself and trotted straight toward the house, his nose low. His tail moving with increasing urgency, he reached the front porch and circled the steps, sniffing the wood, the railing, the base of the door. Then he stopped and barked. Once, twice. "Easy," Colleen murmured, catching up to him. She placed a hand on his neck. The dog was trembling not from cold, but from something else. Excitement. Recognition. The ancient instinct of a creature who knows it has arrived somewhere that matters. That was when she noticed the sign. A weathered wooden post stood near the driveway, slightly tilted from years of frost and thaw. Attached to it was a red and white real estate sign. For sale. Colleen frowned. She had known the house was lost years ago. After her parents fell behind on the mortgage, the bank had taken it. She assumed another family had moved in and lived their own lives within those walls, replaced her memories with their own. But the house was clearly empty. Had been empty for a long time. A small plastic box hung beneath the sign containing a single flyer. Colleen pulled it out. The paper was damp at the edges from recent snow, but the print was still legible. Boyd Prather, Elk Hollow Realty. A local phone number printed beneath the name. Colleen studied the flyer for a long moment. Buying this house would be reckless. Her savings from the Navy were not limitless. The money was supposed to carry her through the uncertain months ahead, while she figured out what a 45-year-old former special operations sailor does with the rest of her life. Spending most of it on a broken-down house in a town she had left behind 2 decades ago made no practical sense. She looked at the house, the sagging porch, the cracked windows, the weeds pushing through the snow. Then she looked at Bear. The dog was sitting on the top step of the porch, perfectly still, staring at the front door, as if waiting for someone inside to open it. Colleen exhaled slowly. "Guess we're doing this," she muttered. She pulled out her phone. The call connected after 2 rings. Elk Hollow Realty. This is Boyd Prather. The voice on the other end was steady and unhurried, the voice of a man who had lived in a small town long enough to speak at the speed of the place itself. "I'm calling about the house on Ridge Hill Road," Colleen said. "The old Mercer place." The name hit her harder than she expected. She swallowed once. "Yes." Boyd Prather arrived within the hour, driving an old brown pickup that looked like it had survived more Wyoming winters than most people. He was a man in his early 50s, tall and lean, with a weathered face and thinning sandy hair beneath a worn canvas cap. His handshake was firm and honest. "You serious about buying this place?" he asked, looking at the house with the practiced eye of a man who knew exactly what was wrong with it. "I grew up here," Colleen said. Boyd looked at her. Something shifted behind his eyes. "Then you probably know it needs a lot of work." "I do." He studied her for another moment. Then his expression softened. He pulled a folder from his truck and set it on the hood. "Sometimes the right people find their way back to the right places," he said. The paperwork took less than 2 hours. Colleen signed the final document leaning against the hood of Boyd's truck, while the cold wind moved across the open field behind the house. When it was done, Boyd handed her a small metal key. It was old, slightly tarnished, heavier than it should have been for something so small. "Welcome home," he said. The word lingered in the air long after his truck disappeared down the gravel road. Colleen walked toward the porch. Bear was already at the door. She inserted the key. The lock resisted for a moment, then turned with a deep, reluctant click. The door swung open with a creak that seemed to come from the house itself, like an old voice clearing its throat after years of silence. Dust floated through thin beams of winter light that streamed through the windows. The air inside smelled of old wood-dried pine and thyme. Colleen stepped over the threshold. The floorboards groaned softly beneath her boots, and the sound traveled through the empty rooms like a heartbeat, returning to a body that had been still for too long. Most of the furniture was gone. The rooms stood bare, their walls marked with the faint shadows of objects that had once given them purpose. But the bones of the house remained. The stone fireplace in the living room, the narrow staircase leading to the second floor, the kitchen with its wide window that faced the valley. And then Colleen noticed something that made her stop. On the kitchen windowsill sat a small ceramic vase. Inside it were dried wildflowers, their color long faded to a pale amber, their stems brittle and thin. The vase was clean, no dust on its surface. And on the floor nearby, in a small area just in front of the fireplace wall, the wooden boards looked noticeably different from the rest of the room. Less dusty, almost tended as if someone had knelt there recently and wiped the surface with a careful hand. Colleen frowned. The house had been empty for years. Boyd Prather had confirmed that no one had rented or occupied the property since it was foreclosed. Yet someone had been here. Someone had placed flowers on this windowsill and cleaned a small patch of floor near the fireplace. She filed the observation away without an answer and moved deeper into the house. The marks on the wall stopped her again. She found them in the hallway near the kitchen. Faint pencil lines drawn horizontally across the painted surface, each one labeled in her mother's careful handwriting. Colleen, age 8. Colleen, age 10. Colleen, age 14. She reached out and touched the last one. Her fingers rested against the line drawn 27 years ago by a woman who measured her daughter's growth the way some people mark the passage of time, carefully, lovingly, with the quiet belief that every inch mattered. Her throat tightened. Bear wandered through the rooms, slowly sniffing every corner, every doorway, every crack in the baseboard. Then he walked to the far wall of the living room, the wall beside the old stone fireplace, and stopped. His ears went forward. His nose pressed against a specific spot on the wooden paneling low and to the right of the hearth. He sniffed. Then he scratched the wood once lightly. Then again. A low whine escaped his throat. "What is it?" Colleen asked from across the room. Bear looked back at her, then returned his attention to the wall. He scratched again, more deliberately this time. Colleen walked over and knelt beside him. She ran her hand along the boards. They felt solid. Old, but solid. Nothing seemed unusual. "Probably mice," she said, scratching behind his ear. "Come on, let's see if the upstairs is still standing." Bear followed her, reluctantly, pausing once to look back at the wall before climbing the stairs. That night, the cold settled over Elk Hollow like a heavy blanket pulled too tight. The temperature dropped well below freezing. The wind moved through the pine forest surrounding the house with a low, steady moan that rattled the loose boards on the porch and pushed thin drafts through the gaps in the old window frames. Colleen lay on the wooden floor of the living room, wrapped in a sleeping bag she had carried in her duffel. A single lantern cast a small circle of warm light against the darkness. Bear lay beside her, close enough that she could feel the steady rise and fall of his breathing. The compression wrap on his shoulder had been removed earlier that week after the last military vet checkup cleared him. The fur was growing back over the scar slowly, a patch of shorter, lighter hair against the dark sable of his coat. For a while, she stared at the ceiling. Shadows moved across the old wooden beams as the lantern flickered. The house creaked and shifted around her, settling into the cold the way it had done for decades, groaning at the joints, whispering through the walls. Then sleep came, and with it, the nightmare. It always began the same way. The dust, the heat, the dry metallic taste of Afghan air at the back of her throat. She was moving through a narrow road flanked by low mud brick walls, the sun directly overhead and relentless. Bear was beside her, slightly ahead, his nose working the ground with the focused intensity that meant something was wrong. Then the sound. Not an explosion. Not yet. First came the click. A small mechanical sound buried beneath the dirt, almost delicate, like a finger snapping underwater. Bear heard it before she did. The dog lunged sideways into her legs, knocking her flat against the ground. The impact sent a searing pain through his right shoulder, the same shoulder that would carry the scar for the rest of his life. The world came apart. Heat, noise, a wall of pressure that slammed through her body like a wave made of stone. Dirt and metal and fragments of things she didn't want to identify rained down around her. Her ears screamed with a high-pitched tone that erased every other sound. And then the voice. Somewhere behind her, through the ringing and the dust, someone was calling her name. She turned. Through the haze, she saw him. Kyle. Specialist Kyle Dunmore. 26 years old. Brown hair. A gap between his front teeth that made his smile look like a kid's. He was on the ground. She crawled toward him. The dust was thick enough to choke on. Her left hand was shaking. Bear was barking somewhere, but the sound came from very far away, as if the explosion had pushed everything in the world 100 yards further from her. She reached Kyle. His eyes were open. He looked at her with an expression she had never seen on a living person before, a mixture of surprise and calm, as if he had just realized something important, but didn't have time to explain it. Then the light went out of his eyes. Colleen woke up gasping. The lantern had burned low. The living room was dark and cold. She was sitting upright, her back pressed against the wall, her left hand trembling against her knee. Sweat covered her face despite the freezing temperature. Bear was already pressed against her side. The dog had positioned himself so that his entire body was in contact with hers from shoulder to hip. His head rested on her thigh, and his amber eyes looked up at her with an expression that said in the only language he knew, "I am here. I am not leaving." Colleen placed her shaking hand on his head. She held it there until the tremor slowed. "I know," she whispered. "I know." Kyle Dunmore had been 26 years old. He had a mother in Tulsa who sent him packages of homemade cookies every month. He had a younger sister who was about to graduate from nursing school. He had told Colleen the night before the mission that he was thinking about proposing to his girlfriend when he got home. He never got home, and Colleen had carried the weight of that ever since. Not because anyone blamed her. The official report cleared her completely. Bear had detected the device. The response was textbook. Kyle's position had simply been too close to the blast radius. It was the kind of tragedy the military filed under acceptable losses and moved past. But Colleen never moved past it. She carried Kyle with her, the way she carried the scar above her eyebrow quietly permanently, in a place where no one could see it, but she could always feel it. Bear shifted slightly, pressing closer against her leg. The dog exhaled a long, slow breath that fogged faintly in the cold air. Colleen looked down at him. "Just us, partner," she said softly. Bear's tail moved once against the floor. Outside, the Wyoming wind swept through the tall pines and across the frozen field. The old house groaned in the darkness. Somewhere in its walls, hidden behind a wooden board that hadn't been moved in over 20 years, 2 envelopes waited in perfect silence. And in the deepest hours of that cold night, Bear lifted his head from the floor one more time. His ears turned toward the wall beside the fireplace. His nostrils flared. Then he lay back down and closed his eyes. He could wait. He had been trained to be patient with things that mattered. Morning came reluctantly to Elk Hollow, as if the sun itself had to be convinced that the small town deserved another day of light. A thin band of gold appeared along the eastern ridge, slowly pushing back the heavy darkness that had settled over the valley through the night. Frost covered every surface. The truck windshield wore a thick white skin of ice. The porch railings glittered like they had been dipped in powdered glass. Colleen woke before dawn the way she always did. 20 years of military discipline had permanently reset the clock inside her body. Sleep was not something she enjoyed. It was something she endured, a necessary maintenance cycle between the hours that actually counted. She stood at the kitchen window holding a tin mug of black coffee she had brewed on a small portable stove. The window faced east, overlooking the frozen field and the dark wall of pine forest beyond it. The valley was perfectly still. No cars, no voices, only the faint sound of wind moving through the highest branches of the trees. A sound so constant in Elk Hollow that most people stopped hearing it after a while. Bear sat beside her, watching the window with his ears slightly forward. His breath fogged the glass near the bottom of the pane. Every few minutes he glanced up at Colleen's face, checking the way he always did, making sure she was still there. Colleen looked down at him. "We've got work to do," she said. The house needed everything. The roof leaked in 2 places, sending thin trails of water down the interior walls whenever the temperature rose enough to melt the snow above. 3 of the porch boards had rotted through completely. The windows on the second floor were cracked, and cold air moved through them freely, turning the upstairs into something closer to a refrigerator than a living space. But Colleen did not mind. She had spent years in places far worse. Forward operating bases built from plywood and sandbags. Ships where the corridors were so narrow you learned to sleep standing up. A broken house in Wyoming was by comparison almost comfortable. She began working that first morning and did not stop. Day after day, she rose before the sun and carried tools to whatever part of the house needed attention most. She pulled ruined boards from the porch and replaced them with fresh lumber from the hardware store in town. She patched the roof leaks with tar paper and determination. She scraped old paint from the window frames, sanded the wood beneath, and sealed the cracks that let the cold pour through. Bear was always nearby. His shoulder had healed steadily since they arrived in Elk Hollow. The compression wrap was gone now, and the scar beneath his fur had closed cleanly. At 6 years old, he was in his physical prime once more, strong and alert with a calm vigilance that made him seem less like a pet and more like a permanent sentry. While Colleen worked, Bear would sit on the grass a few yards away, watching the tree line, his ears turning at the slightest sound. Sometimes Colleen spoke to him while she worked. "Hand me that wrench, would you?" she said one morning, kneeling beside a broken porch step. Bear tilted his head and stared at her. "Figured," she muttered, reaching for it herself. The town noticed her slowly. Elk Hollow was the kind of place where a new face was an event, and a returning face was something closer to a mystery. People saw the black pickup truck parked on Ridge Hill Road. They saw the woman working on the old Mercer house from dawn to dusk. Word spread the way it always did in small towns, through the diner, the grocery store, and the post office, traveling faster than any official announcement ever could. "That is Garrett and June's daughter. She was in the Navy. 20 years. She came back." Some people drove past the house, slowly looking. A few waved. Colleen waved back but did not invite conversation. It was Hank Calloway who broke the silence first. Hank arrived at the house on a Tuesday morning, driving a rust-colored Ford that looked like it had been built during a different presidency. He climbed out slowly, a man in his early 50s with a lean, weathered frame and thick hands scarred from decades of working with engines, metal, and machines that other people had given up on. His dark hair had turned mostly gray, and a short bristled beard covered his jaw. His brown eyes were sharp, but carried a warmth beneath them, the kind of warmth that only settled into a face after years of watching people struggle and choosing to help anyway. Hank had been the town's mechanic for over 30 years. He had known Colleen's parents well. Garrett Mercer had built the cabinets in Hank's workshop. June Mercer had brought soup to Hank's wife when she was sick. In a town the size of Elk Hollow, those kinds of connections were not small. They were the invisible architecture that held everything together. "You look like your father," Hank said, standing near the porch with his hands in his jacket pockets. Colleen paused, a hammer resting on her knee. "People keep telling me that." "That's because it's true." Hank looked at the house. His eyes moved slowly across the new porch boards, the patched roof, the freshly sanded window frames. "You're doing good work here. It's a start." Hank was quiet for a moment. Then he said something Colleen was not prepared for. "Your folks didn't just lose this place because of the bank, Colleen." She set the hammer down. Bear, who had been lying near the steps, lifted his head. Hank spoke carefully, the way a man speaks when he has carried a story inside him for years and is finally setting it down. He told her about a man named Warren Locke, a real estate investor from Cheyenne, who had operated in the region for decades, buying distressed properties from banks, pressuring families who were behind on payments, and flipping the land for development. 22 years ago, when Garrett and June Mercer fell behind on their mortgage during a bad stretch, it was Warren Locke who bought their debt from the bank. Not to help, to squeeze. He accelerated the timeline, forced the foreclosure faster than the bank would have, and acquired the property at a fraction of its value. Garrett tried to fight it. He went to the county office. He wrote letters. He even drove to Cheyenne once to confront Locke in person. But Garrett Mercer was a carpenter, not a lawyer. And Warren Locke had lawyers the way some people had spare change. The house was taken. Garrett and June left Elk Hollow with almost nothing. "Your father never forgave himself for losing this place," Hank said quietly. "Not because of the house, because he felt like he failed you, like he couldn't protect the place where you grew up." Colleen said nothing for a long time. She stared at the porch floor, at the new boards she had laid over the bones of the home her father had built and then been forced to abandon. "Where is Locke now?" she asked. "Still around," Hank said. "He's got plans for the land east of town. Wants to build some kind of resort. Vacation cabins, hiking trails, the whole package. He's been buying up property in the area for the last few years." Hank paused. "Including the land around this house." That evening after Hank had gone, Colleen sat alone on the porch in the cold. Bear lay at her feet. The valley was dark and quiet. Stars filled the sky above the mountains in numbers she had forgotten were possible. She thought about her father, the strong, quiet man who built things with his hands and believed that honest work was enough to hold the world together. She thought about him driving to Cheyenne alone, walking into an office where no one knew his name, trying to save a house he had built with lumber he had cut himself. And she thought about the man who had taken it all from him. Something hardened inside her chest. Not anger exactly, something colder. Something more patient. The wind moved through the pines. Bear pressed his head against her boot. Colleen looked out across the dark valley and said nothing. The weather reports began changing 3 days later. A deep low-pressure system was moving down from Montana, gathering moisture and cold air as it crossed the mountains. The forecasters on the radio used words like significant and historic and urged residents to prepare for possible power outages and road closures. The people of Elk Hollow listened the way they always listened to weather warnings. Some took them seriously. Most assumed the storm would be like every other storm. They were wrong. The blizzard arrived on a Thursday afternoon with a speed that surprised everyone. The sky turned from pale gray to the color of iron in less than an hour. The wind came first, roaring down from the mountains with the force that bent the pine trees at sharp angles and sent loose objects tumbling across yards. Then the snow followed, not the gentle drifting kind. This snow fell in thick horizontal sheets driven by the wind into a wall of white that erased roads, fences, and buildings in minutes. By early evening, the power across Elk Hollow failed. The lights flickered twice, then died. The town went dark. Colleen stood on the porch of the old house watching the storm swallow the valley. Bear sat beside her, his thick fur already dusted with snow. The dog lifted his nose into the wind and gave a low, uneasy growl. "Yeah," Colleen murmured. "It's going to be a bad one." She could have stayed home. Most people would. But as the wind screamed through the darkness, a memory rose inside her. Her father standing outside during a storm 25 years ago, helping a neighbor repair a fallen fence. Her mother carrying a pot of hot soup through knee-deep snow to the Strickland house down the road because Vernon's back had gone out and Opal couldn't cook. Help first, ask questions later. For most of her adult life, Colleen had believed she was nothing like her parents. She had chosen the military, chosen a world measured in threat levels and mission objectives. Garrett and June Mercer had chosen kindness, soup and fence repairs and library visits. But standing on that porch in the howling wind, Colleen realized something she had not allowed herself to see before. The instinct was the same. Her parents ran toward trouble to help. She ran toward trouble to protect. The direction was identical. Only the uniform was different. She grabbed her heavy coat. "Come on, Bear." The dog was already at the door. The town was almost unrecognizable beneath the storm. Snow piled against parked cars and darkened storefronts. Streetlights stood dead and silent. Colleen drove slowly through the streets, the truck's headlights cutting two narrow tunnels through the white chaos. The first place she stopped was the small white church near the center of town. A handful of people stood outside in the wind, struggling with the large metal generator that refused to start. It was Hank Calloway. "Thank God," Hank shouted over the wind. "This generator won't turn over. The church is full of people trying to stay warm." Colleen climbed out of the truck and knelt beside the machine. Snow and moisture had seeped into the fuel line, and the starter coil was corroded. She had repaired worse equipment under far worse conditions. "Give me 10 minutes, she said calmly. Bear sat nearby on the snow-covered sidewalk, watching the storm with focused attention. True to her word, the generator roared to life. Warm yellow light flooded through the church windows. Hank laughed with relief. "You really are your father's daughter," he said. Colleen didn't respond, but something shifted inside her when he said those words. A door she had kept locked for a very long time opened just slightly. For the next several hours, Colleen moved through the storm like a quiet force. She pulled a stranded sedan out of a snowbank using the truck's tow chain. She helped carry supplies from the grocery store to the church shelter. She found Vernon and Opal Strickland still in their house on the south side of town, the old couple too stubborn or too frightened to leave. Vernon Strickland was in his late 70s, thin and pale with trembling hands. His wife Opal was small and gentle, her silver hair tied neatly beneath a wool hat. They clung to Colleen's arms as she guided them through the deep snow toward the truck. "Your mother helped us during the flood," Opal said softly. 20 years ago. She carried blankets to our house in the rain." Colleen paused. "I remember," she said quietly. But the storm was not finished. Late that night, long after the church shelter was full, Colleen decided to drive back toward Ridge Hill Road. Bear was in the passenger seat. He had been calm for most of the night, conserving energy the way trained working dogs learn to do between moments of action. But as the truck turned onto the forest road, something changed. Bear lifted his head sharply. His ears stiffened. His body went rigid. Then he barked. Sharp. Urgent. Colleen slowed the truck. "What is it?" Bear barked again. He lunged toward the door, pressing his nose against the window. She pulled the truck to the side of the road. "All right, show me." The moment the door opened, Bear leaped into the storm. He hit the deep snow and began moving through the trees, his nose working the ground, his body cutting a path through the drifts with powerful strides. Colleen followed her flashlight beam, bouncing through the falling snow. Then she saw the tire tracks. Faint, already half buried, but unmistakable. They veered off the road and disappeared down a slope into the forest. Her stomach tightened. She hurried after Bear. The dog had already reached the bottom of the slope and was barking continuously. Colleen's flashlight found the wreck. A small blue sedan had slid off the road, tumbled down the embankment, and come to rest on its side against a cluster of pine trees. Snow was already beginning to bury the vehicle. Colleen ran forward. "Hello," she shouted. "Can you hear me?" No answer. She forced the passenger door upward and shined the flashlight inside. A woman was trapped against the driver's seat, held in place by a locked seatbelt. Her head was tilted to one side. Her eyes were closed. A thin line of blood ran from a cut along her hairline. She was unconscious but breathing. Colleen would later learn her name. Nora Beckett. Nora was in her early 30s, tall and slender, with long chestnut brown hair that had fallen across her pale face in dark tangled waves. Even in the harsh beam of the flashlight, Colleen could see she had delicate, thoughtful features. A pair of wire-rimmed glasses had fallen to the floor of the car, one lens cracked. Colleen cut the seatbelt and carefully lifted the woman from the car. Bear stood at the base of the slope, barking up into the storm, urging them forward. Colleen wrapped her jacket around Nora and carried her up the embankment step by heavy step. The snow pulled at her boots. The wind tried to push her sideways. Her lower back screamed in protest, the old injury flaring like a cold that had never fully gone cold. But she did not stop. They reached the truck. Colleen placed Nora gently inside and started the engine. Bear jumped in beside the unconscious woman and positioned himself so that his body pressed against hers, sharing warmth the way he had been trained to do with injured operators in the field. The drive to the small clinic took 15 minutes through the storm. When they arrived, a nurse and a doctor rushed outside with a stretcher. The nurse looked at Colleen with surprise. "You found her out there in this?" Colleen nodded. "Her car went off the forest road. My dog found her." She waited at the clinic for 2 hours, sitting in a hard plastic chair with Bear lying across her feet. Near midnight, the doctor told her Nora was stable. Mild concussion, bruised ribs, hypothermia that would have turned fatal within another hour if she had not been found. Colleen thanked him and stood to leave. That was when Nora woke up. From the doorway, Colleen heard a voice, thin and confused, but conscious. "Wait." She turned. Nora Beckett was lying on the examination table, her face pale beneath a bandage, her hazel eyes open and focused. She looked directly at Colleen. "I was coming to find you," Nora said. The room went very quiet. Colleen stepped closer. "What do you mean?" Nora spoke carefully, each word deliberate despite her weakness. "I work at the town library. I've been organizing the old archives in the basement for months. I found something about your family." She paused to take a breath. "But that's not why I was driving tonight. This afternoon before the storm hit, a man came into the library asking for county property records. He was looking at parcels around Ridge Hill Road. Your road. I recognized his name on the request form. Warren Locke." Colleen felt something tighten at the base of her spine. "He filed a formal inquiry with the county assessor's office last week," Nora continued. "He's trying to challenge the sale of your property, claiming the previous foreclosure gives him a standing lien on the land. I don't know if it's legal or just pressure, but I thought you needed to know, tonight, before he made his next move." Nora reached toward the small table beside the bed. Among her personal belongings was a manila envelope creased and damp from the snow, but intact. "I also found this," she said, "in the library archives. Your mother left it years ago before she left Elk Hollow. She gave it to the old librarian, Mrs. Prescott, and asked her to keep it safe." Colleen took the envelope. Her hands were still cold and the paper felt fragile between her fingers. She opened it carefully. Inside was an old photograph faded with age, its edges worn soft. The image showed a group of people standing beside a half-built wooden bridge over a creek. In the center of the group stood her parents. Garrett Mercer, younger, his sleeves rolled up, his strong hands gripping a wooden beam. June Mercer beside him, smiling warmly, her hand resting on the bridge railing as if she had helped build it herself. Colleen stared at the photograph for a long time. Beneath the photo was a small folded note, her mother's handwriting. Soft, rounded letters on a piece of lined paper that had yellowed with age. The note read, "If my daughter ever returns to Elk Hollow, please tell her that we left something for her inside the house. She will understand." Colleen read the note twice, then a third time. Bear pressed his nose against her hand. She was already moving toward the door. The storm outside had weakened to a thin, tired snowfall. The streets were buried but passable. The truck started on the first try. Bear jumped into the cab. His ears were forward. His tail moved with that deliberate, focused wag that meant he understood something important was happening. Colleen drove through the dark, snow-covered streets toward Ridge Hill Road. She followed the path from memory, the same path she had walked 1,000 times as a child. The house appeared on the hill, dark and silent against the sky. She pushed the front door open. The living room was dark except for faint moonlight through the window. She turned on her flashlight. Bear did not hesitate. The moment they entered the room, the German Shepherd walked directly to the wall beside the fireplace. The same spot he had scratched on their very first night. The same spot he had returned to again and again. This time he did not scratch gently. Bear clawed at the wooden panel with sudden, fierce determination. His nails scraped the old boards. A sharp bark echoed through the empty room. Colleen knelt beside him. Her flashlight beam moved across the wall. One board was different. The wood grain ran at a slightly different angle. A thin line of dust had settled along its edges, marking a seam that someone had carefully hidden decades ago. Colleen pressed her hand against the board. It moved. Her fingers found the edge and pulled. The wood resisted for a moment, swollen slightly from years of cold and moisture, then came free with a low, dull creak that seemed to travel through the bones of the house itself. Behind the panel was a hollow space, narrow and dark, carved into the wall between the old stone fireplace and the outer frame. The space was no larger than a shoebox lined with rough timber that had darkened with age. Dust floated upward into the flashlight beam like tiny ghosts disturbed from a long sleep. 2 envelopes lay inside. They were old. Very old. The paper had turned the color of weak tea, and the corners had curled inward from decades of dry, undisturbed air. But the envelopes were intact, preserved by the darkness and the tight seal of the hidden compartment, as if time had agreed to leave them alone. Colleen reached inside slowly and pulled them out. Each envelope had a name written on the front, in handwriting she recognized instantly. The first envelope read, "For Colleen from Dad." The second read, "For Colleen from Mom." Something inside her chest tightened with a force that had nothing to do with muscle or bone. It was the kind of tightness that comes when the body encounters an emotion too large for the space it occupies, when the distance between the past and the present suddenly collapses, and everything you thought you had buried rises to the surface at once. Colleen sat down slowly on the wooden floor beside the fireplace. The flashlight rested on the ground beside her, casting a long beam across the dusty room. Bear walked over and sat beside her, pressing his shoulder against her arm. The dog was completely still, watching her face with those steady amber eyes that had seen every version of her there was. She opened the first letter carefully. Her father's handwriting. Strong and slightly uneven, the penmanship of a man whose hands were built for tools, not pens. "Colleen, if you are reading this, then something we barely dared to hope for has actually happened. Your mother and I hid these letters here before we left this house. The bank had already taken everything. We had no choice but to walk away. We knew we would probably never see this place again. But before we left, your mother had a thought. She said, what if someday our daughter comes back? What if years from now, Colleen becomes the kind of woman who finds her way home? I told her the chances were almost impossible. You were already in the Navy by then, somewhere on the other side of the world. The house was being sold. There was no reason to believe anyone in our family would ever set foot inside these walls again. But hope is a stubborn thing. It doesn't listen to reason. It doesn't care about odds. It just sits quietly inside you and refuses to leave. So we hid these letters in the wall beside the fireplace, the spot where you used to sit as a little girl and read your books, while I kept the fire going on winter nights. We chose that spot because it was yours. It always was. If you are reading this now, then that small, stubborn hope came true. I don't know what your life looks like. I don't know what brought you back here. Maybe everything went well for you. Maybe it didn't. Life has a way of breaking things you thought were permanent and building things you never expected. But I want you to know something, Colleen. And I want you to hear it in my voice, even though I can only give you these words on paper. You always belong somewhere. No matter how far you traveled, no matter how long you were gone, you always had a place in this world. And for you, that place started right here. In this house, in this town, with the people who loved you first. I am proud of you. I was proud of you the day you left for the Navy. I was proud of you every single day after that, even the days when I couldn't tell you. Welcome home, sweetheart. Dad. Colleen lowered the letter slowly. The room was silent except for the wind against the windows. She realized her hands were trembling. Not the familiar tremor from the nerve damage, but something deeper. Something that came from a place no doctor had ever examined and no mission had ever reached. She swallowed once. Then she reached for the second envelope. Her mother's handwriting. Softer, rounder, written with careful grace. My dear Colleen, if you found this letter, then the miracle your father and I dreamed about has happened. You came home. When we left this house, my heart didn't break because we lost the building. Wood and nails and paint can be replaced. My heart broke because I was afraid we might lose what lived inside these walls. The memories, the mornings, the sound of your footsteps on the stairs when you were small, the way the light came through the kitchen window and fell across the table where we ate breakfast together every day for 18 years. Your father and I raised you here. Every corner of this house holds something invisible and precious. Laughter, arguments, birthday candles, the smell of coffee on cold mornings, the sound of rain on the roof while you did your homework at the kitchen table. We didn't want those things to disappear forever. So we left these letters with one tiny, impossible hope. Maybe one day our daughter would grow into the kind of woman strong enough and brave enough to find her way back. If that day has come, then I want you to know something, and I want you to carry it with you for the rest of your life. You were always our greatest joy. Not because of what you achieved, not because of the uniform you wore or the things you did that we were never allowed to know about. You were our joy simply because you existed, because you were ours. No matter where life took you, we were always proud of you. And if you are reading this now, it means you have already done something remarkable. You came home. Love always, Mom. Colleen sat completely still. The flashlight had dimmed slightly, and the room had grown darker around her. She could hear her own breathing. Bear's breathing, the wind outside, the creak of the old porch. The letters rested in her lap. 2 pieces of paper. A few hundred words. Written by 2 people who had lost almost everything and still found a way to leave behind the one thing that mattered most. Hope. Not the loud, dramatic kind, the quiet kind. The kind that hides inside a wall and waits 20 years for someone to find it. Colleen leaned her head back against the wall and closed her eyes. The emptiness inside her felt different. Not gone, not healed, but quieter, as if something that had been screaming for years had finally been heard and could now rest. Bear placed his head on her knee. His eyes drifted closed. Colleen placed her hand on his head and held it there. "Well," she whispered softly, "I guess we really did come home." Then her flashlight caught something else. Inside the hollow space behind where the letters had rested, there was another object. Colleen reached in and pulled it out carefully. It was a piece of paper larger than the letters, folded twice and slightly stiffer. She unfolded it on the floor beside the flashlight. A drawing, done in pencil with the precise, steady lines of a man who had spent his life building things. It was a floor plan hand-drawn showing the house as it currently existed on the left side of the page, and on the right side, an expansion. Additional rooms, a larger kitchen, a wide common area with a fireplace, a covered porch that wrapped around the entire structure. Across the top of the drawing in her father's handwriting were the words Elk Hollow Community Shelter. And in the bottom corner in smaller letters, "If you come back, finish what I couldn't." Colleen stared at the drawing for a very long time. And somewhere deep inside her, beneath the grief and the guilt and the years of trained silence, something began to shift. Not a thought exactly. Something closer to a direction. A compass needle that had been spinning aimlessly for months, finally pointing towards something real. Her father had dreamed of turning this house into a place for the community. A shelter. A gathering point. He never got the chance. The house was taken before he could begin. But the dream survived. Hidden in a wall. Waiting. Spring arrived slowly in Elk Hollow, the way it always did in the Wyoming mountains. The snow retreated inch by inch. Dark patches of soil appeared between the trees. The frozen creek began to move again, first as a trickle, then as a steady stream that caught the sunlight and scattered it across the rocks. Colleen worked on the house every day. She replaced the remaining damaged boards. She installed new windows on the second floor. She cleaned the fireplace and rebuilt the grate. She repainted the exterior a clean, warm white that made the house visible from the road below. And as she worked, the mystery of the dried flowers and the clean floor finally found its answer. It was Hank Calloway who told her casually one afternoon while helping her carry lumber to the porch. "You know old Mrs. Prescott," he said. "The woman who ran the library before Nora." "I remember the name," Colleen said. "She was there when I was a kid." "She passed away about 2 years ago," Hank said. 91 years old. But before that, she used to drive up here every few months, right up until her legs gave out. Then she'd send her granddaughter to do it. Colleen stopped working. Do what? Leave flowers on the windowsill. Clean the floor in front of the fireplace. Hank looked at her carefully. "Your mother asked her to. Before your parents left Elk Hollow, you went to Mrs. Prescott and told her where the letters were hidden. She asked her to watch over the spot. Keep it tended. Make sure nothing happened to that section of wall." Colleen stood very still. She told Mrs. Prescott that someday you might come back, Hank continued. And when you did, the letters needed to be there waiting. Colleen looked toward the living room window. The ceramic vase still sat on the sill. The dried flowers were still inside it, placed there by the hands of a woman keeping a promise to a friend who had already been gone for years. Her mother had arranged everything. The letters, the note at the library, the caretaker who tended the hiding place like a small sacred garden. All of it built on the belief that one day her daughter would walk through that door again. Colleen turned back to the lumber and picked up her hammer. She did not trust herself to speak. Nora Beckett came by often during those weeks. The young librarian had recovered well from the accident. The bruises had faded, and the thin scar along her forehead had become something she wore without self-consciousness. She usually arrived in the late afternoon carrying books or old photographs from the library archives. Their friendship developed the way real friendships do between people who have both known loss. Slowly, without pressure. Nora had lost her own parents in a car accident 5 years earlier. She understood the particular kind of loneliness that comes from being the last person standing in a family. She never tried to fill Colleen's silence with words. She simply sat beside it and let it be. One evening while they sat on the porch watching the valley turn gold in the fading light, Colleen told Nora about Kyle Dunmore. She had never told anyone. Not Philip, not the military counselors who had offered their services after the mission. Not a single person in 20 years. But something about the way Nora listened without leaning forward, without widening her eyes, without making the kind of sympathetic sounds that people use when they want you to know they care, but don't actually know what to say. Something about that stillness made the words come. Colleen told her about the road, the click beneath the dirt, Bear's lunge, the explosion, and the 26-year-old specialist who had been standing 3 feet too close and paid for it with everything he had and everything he would ever have. When she finished, the porch was quiet. The wind moved through the pines. Bear lay at Colleen's feet, his ears relaxed, his breathing slow. Nora didn't say anything for a long time. Then she said simply, "What was he like? Not how did he die? Not was it your fault? Not have you talked to someone about this? What was he like?" And Colleen found herself smiling. A small, fragile smile that broke something loose inside her chest. "He had this gap between his front teeth," she said. "Made him look about 12 years old. And he sent his mom these terrible drawings on the back of MRE boxes. Called them postcards. They sat together on the porch until the stars came out. And when Colleen went inside that night, the weight she had carried for years felt different. Not lighter exactly, but shared. As if she had finally set down a bag she had been holding alone, and someone had simply placed their hand on it beside hers. The trouble with Warren Locke arrived not as a confrontation, but as a letter. A thick envelope from a law firm in Cheyenne delivered to Colleen's mailbox on a Tuesday morning. Inside was a formal notice informing her that Locke Development Group was contesting the validity of her property purchase. The letter cited an obscure clause related to the original foreclosure, claiming that a prior lien held by Locke's company had not been properly discharged before the property was resold. It demanded that Colleen either enter negotiations for a sale or face legal proceedings to nullify her ownership. Colleen read the letter at the kitchen table while Bear lay nearby. She read it twice. Then she folded it and placed it in a drawer. She did not panic. Panic was something she had trained out of herself a long time ago. But she understood what the letter meant. Locke was not going away. He had the money, the lawyers, and the patience to make her life difficult for as long as it took. 3 days later, a second letter arrived. This one was not from a lawyer. It was from the county assessor's office informing her that a formal review of her property's tax assessment had been requested by an unnamed party. The review could result in a significant increase in property taxes, potentially tripling the annual cost. Colleen recognized the strategy. Locke could not simply take her house, but he could make it impossible for her to afford keeping it. Squeeze from both sides. Legal pressure and financial pressure applied simultaneously until the target surrendered. It was the same strategy he had used against her father 22 years ago. The dark gray SUV appeared on Ridge Hill Road 3 days after the second letter. Warren Locke stepped out. He was 58 years old, tall and lean, with silver hair combed back neatly, and expensive outdoor clothing that was designed to look rugged without ever being used for anything rugged. His blue eyes were sharp and assessing. He walked toward the house with the relaxed confidence of someone who expected every conversation to end in his favor. "Ms. Mercer," he called out pleasantly. Colleen was standing on the porch. Bear was beside her. The dog's ears went flat and his body stiffened. "I know who you are," Colleen said, "and I know what you did to my parents." Something shifted behind Locke's eyes. A recalculation. "I'm a businessman, Miss Mercer. What happened 20 years ago was a transaction, nothing personal." It was personal to them. Locke's smile remained, but the temperature behind it dropped. "I'm prepared to offer you 3 times what you paid. That's generous considering the legal questions surrounding your title." "No." "You should think carefully," Locke said. "I have strong relationships with the local bank and the county planning office. Development is coming to this area. You can participate in that future, or you can be left behind by it." "My father was left behind by men like you," Colleen said. "I'm not him." Locke studied her for a moment. Then he nodded slowly and walked back to his SUV. Bear watched him the entire way. After Locke drove away, Colleen stood on the porch for a long time. The letters from the lawyer sat in the kitchen drawer. The threat was real. She had enough savings to hold on for a year, maybe 18 months. After that, if Locke succeeded in raising her taxes and dragging her into legal proceedings, the math would become impossible. She was running out of moves. The confrontation came on a Sunday morning in early April. Hank Calloway had arranged a meeting at the church. When Colleen arrived, she was surprised to find the church nearly full. More than 60 people sat in the pews. Hank stood at the front and spoke simply. He told the story of Garrett and June Mercer, how they had organized the rebuilding of the town bridge after the flood, how they had helped neighbors during every storm, every crisis, every difficult winter, how they had been forced out of their home by a man who saw land as profit and people as obstacles. Then he told them about the letters hidden in the wall, 2 parents who believed against all probability that their daughter would return, and he told them about the drawing, the community shelter Garrett Mercer had designed but never built. Finally, he told them about Locke's legal campaign, the letters from the lawyers, the tax reassessment, the slow, deliberate pressure designed to force Colleen out of her home the same way her father had been forced out 2 decades before. The church was very quiet when Hank finished speaking. Vernon Strickland stood up. The old man's hands trembled, but his voice did not. "Garrett Mercer carried my wife through 3 feet of snow during the storm of '99, Vernon said. "June brought us food every week for a month after my surgery." He looked at Colleen. "Their daughter pulled us out of our house during the blizzard last winter, carried Opal to the truck herself." He paused. "If this family says this town needs a shelter, then this town needs a shelter. And if some man from Cheyenne thinks he can run another Mercer out of this town, he's going to have to run all of us out first." One by one, others stood. The owner of the diner offered to donate lumber. A retired electrician volunteered his time. 2 ranchers from outside town said they could provide labor on weekends. Boyd Prather, the real estate agent, offered to handle any legal paperwork at no charge, and said he had a friend who was a property lawyer in Casper who owed him a favor. The lawyer could challenge Locke's lien claim directly, and Boyd was confident it wouldn't hold up once someone actually fought back. Colleen stood at the front of the church. She had not planned to speak. Public words had never been her strength, but she looked at the faces in front of her. Old faces and young ones, people who had known her parents, people who remembered her as a girl. She spoke simply. "My father designed this shelter because he believed this town was worth protecting," she said. "He couldn't build it, but he left the plans behind hidden in a wall with the hope that someone would finish what he started." She paused. "I didn't come back here to live in the past. I came back to continue something, and I can't do it alone." That was all she said. It was enough. In the weeks that followed, Boyd Prather's lawyer friend filed a formal challenge to Locke's lien claim. The challenge worked its way through the county legal system with the quiet efficiency of a case built on solid ground. As Boyd had predicted, Locke's claim was thin, a pressure tactic, not a genuine legal position. By late April, the county dismissed the challenge entirely. Colleen's ownership was confirmed. Warren Locke drove past Ridge Hill Road one last time on a morning in early May. He slowed his SUV and looked at the hillside where the old Mercer house had stood alone for years. What he saw now was different. A dozen trucks were parked along the gravel road. The sound of hammers and saws carried across the valley. More than 30 people moved across the property carrying lumber measuring walls, laying foundations for the new additions. Locke watched for a long moment through the tinted window. Then he drove away and did not return. The following weeks transformed Ridge Hill Road. Every morning, trucks appeared carrying lumber tools and volunteers. The sound of construction echoed across the valley from dawn until the light failed. Colleen worked alongside everyone measuring, cutting, lifting. Bear wandered among the workers like an unofficial site supervisor, occasionally sitting beside someone who looked tired, as if offering silent encouragement. The house grew. New walls rose beside the old ones. The common room took shape, wide and open, with large windows facing the valley and a new stone fireplace at its center. The covered porch extended around the building. Storage rooms were added for emergency supplies. A kitchen large enough to feed 50 people materialized where dead weeds had been. On a warm afternoon in late May, Colleen stood inside the nearly completed common room. The space was large and bright, smelling of fresh pine and sawdust. Sunlight poured through the windows. Workers moved around her, installing the last of the trim work and finishing the floors. Colleen carried a single piece of lumber to the far wall. It was a short plank of dark walnut, sanded smooth, the same type of wood her father used to work with. She had carved something into its surface the night before, working slowly by lantern light with the old pocket knife Garrett had given her on her 15th birthday. She nailed the plank to the wall beside the entrance to the common room at eye level, where everyone who entered would see it. Carved into the wood in simple, clean letters were 2 lines. Elk Hollow Community Shelter. In memory of Kyle Dunmore, who never got to come home. Nora found her standing in front of it a few minutes later. She read the words. She looked at Colleen. She said nothing. She simply stood beside her for a while, and that was enough. On a warm evening in late May, when the shelter was far enough along that its shape was unmistakable against the sky, Colleen called Philip. He answered on the second ring. Colleen. "I'm not calling to come back," she said. A pause. "I know. I'm calling to say thank you." The silence that followed was the kind that holds meaning completely and carefully. "If you hadn't left," Colleen said quietly, "I might never have found my way back here. I might have spent the rest of my life in that empty house in Norfolk, trying to be someone I wasn't anymore." Philip was quiet for a long time. When he spoke, his voice was thick. "Are you okay?" he asked. Colleen looked out the kitchen window. The valley was green. The field beside the house was full of wildflowers. Bear lay on the new porch, his chin on his paws, his eyes half closed in the warm light. "Yeah," she said. "I think I am." After the call, Colleen walked to the living room. The 2 letters and her father's drawing were framed, now mounted on the wall beside the stone fireplace. Next to them hung the old photograph Nora had brought from the library, the image of Garrett and June Mercer standing beside the half-built bridge, surrounded by neighbors building something together. She reached up and straightened the frame slightly. The front door opened behind her. Nora stepped inside carrying 2 mugs of coffee. She handed one to Colleen without a word. They walked outside together and sat on the porch swing. The same swing Colleen had rebuilt, the one her mother had loved, the one June Mercer used to sit on every evening and watch the light change over the mountains. Bear lay near the steps, stretched out comfortably, his sable-black fur warm from the sun. His breathing was slow and deep. His shoulder had healed completely. The scar beneath his fur was just another part of him now. Like the scar on his muzzle, like the scars Colleen carried in places no one could see. The sky above the valley had turned the color of fire orange and gold, spreading across the horizon as the sun lowered behind the mountain ridge. Birds moved through the pine trees. A soft breeze carried the scent of wildflowers and fresh-cut lumber and the distant sweetness of the creek running through the valley below. Neither of them spoke for a while. The quiet was not empty. It was full, the way a room is full after everyone you love has been in it. Nora sipped her coffee. "You know," she said with a small, careful smile, "people in town talk about you a lot now." Colleen raised an eyebrow. "That good or bad?" "Mostly good." Bear lifted his head at the sound of Nora's voice, considered the situation briefly, then lowered it back to his paws. The sun disappeared behind the mountains slowly, as if it wanted to give the valley one last look before leaving. Shadows climbed the hillside. The air cooled. The first stars appeared above the ridge, faint and patient. Colleen felt something she had stopped expecting to find. It was not happiness exactly. It was something quieter and more durable. It was the feeling of being in the right place at the right time for the right reasons. The feeling of a compass needle finally resting still. She had spent 20 years protecting a country she loved from threats most of its citizens would never know about. She had lost a marriage, a friend, and 2 decades of moments she could never recover. She had come home to an empty house and driven across the continent with nothing but a dog who trusted her and a box of memories she was afraid to open. And waiting for her hidden behind an old wall in a house on a hill, in a town that time had nearly forgotten, were 2 letters and a drawing, left by 2 people who had lost everything except the one thing that mattered most, the belief that their daughter would come home. Sometimes life removes the things we hold closest, and the loss feels so complete that moving forward seems impossible. Colleen had known that feeling. She had lived inside it for years, carrying it silently the way soldiers carry wounds that never fully close. But hidden inside that loss, tucked away where only patience and faith could find it, was something small and indestructible. A hope so quiet it could survive decades of silence. A love so steady it could outlast death distance and every reasonable argument against its survival. Her parents had believed in her before she believed in herself. They had trusted the future before they could see it. And they had left behind exactly enough for her to find her way. Not a fortune. A fortune would not have been enough. Just 2 letters, a drawing, and the unshakable conviction that their daughter was worth waiting for. The porch swing rocked gently in the evening breeze. Bear sighed contentedly at her feet. Nora sat beside her, quiet and present. Behind them, through the open door, the framed letters glowed faintly in the last light of day. And inside the common room of the new shelter, a plank of dark walnut hung on the wall beside the entrance, bearing the name of a young man who never made it home, placed there by the woman who carried him with her across oceans and years, and finally found a way to let him rest. Colleen took a slow breath of the cool mountain air. She looked out across the valley at the town below, at the green fields, at the mountains rising dark against the fading sky. She was not the same person who had walked away from this place 2 decades ago. She was someone shaped by loss and rebuilt by love. Someone who had finally stopped running and discovered that the thing she had been searching for had been waiting here all along. Not the past, the future. And this time, she was not alone.